Chapter 16, Video 2, we're looking at the events that lead toward the Civil War here. Most people are familiar with Uncle Tom's Cabin, whether you've read it or not. It was a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe where she described slavery. This book is going to be very widely read in the North and change a lot of people's opinions about slavery. People who had never even thought about the issue are going to read this book and start to be concerned about slavery and want to do something about it. Abraham Lincoln later will give Harriet Beecher Stowe a lot of credit. He will refer to her as the little lady who started the Great War. Now, we come to the election of 1852, and the Democrats are going to run Franklin Pierce, and the Republicans ran General Winfield Scott. Pierce will be elected, and he believed that the best way to keep the peace between the North and the South would be to keep a balance between slave and free states. And at this point in time, the free states had the edge. And so he's going to be interested in acquiring some territory to our south to balance out that whole issue. And so we look at Cuba. And we have something called the Ostend Manifesto. There were, we made an offer for Cuba. The United States offered Spain $130 million for Cuba in 1854, and Spain turned us down. They probably regretted that later when Cuba declared their independence, but they turned it down. It was a good price at the time. Well, we had some ambassadors. Our ambassador to Spain, our ambassador to France, and our ambassador to Britain got together in Ostend, Belgium to talk about a variety of issues, and among them they talked about Cuba and Spain's rejection of our offer. They put together something called the Ostend Manifesto where they suggested, hey, why don't we just go take Cuba? We could say that it was for our national security. Well, that document, the Ostend Manifesto, leaked to the press and created an international uproar, and we had to drop the idea. We also see the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We were looking for a good path for a transcontinental railroad, across the continent railroad. Jefferson Davis had found a southern path that he thought looked good. We just needed a little sliver of land in the southwest, and we're going to do something called the Gadsden Purchase, where we buy a little piece of land that now is part of New Mexico and Arizona. We bought it from Mexico for $10 million, and that was going to make a good, clear southern route for a transcontinental railroad. Stephen Douglas from Illinois wanted to see a more northern route, and that northern route would cut through Kansas and Nebraska area, and so those territories needed to be settled and resolved. The better choice probably was Jefferson Davis's route, but we will be a separate country when they start building that transcontinental railroad, and so the northern route is what will get built first. Well, Kansas and Nebraska Act said that those two territories would use popular sovereignty to decide whether or not they wanted slavery. So the people would vote on it. Nebraska quickly voted to be free, but Kansas quickly became a battleground as both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces moved into Kansas. It became such a battleground that actually Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas or Bloody Kansas. There even was something called the Sack of Lawrence, where a group of pro-slavery folks attacked the city of Lawrence, Kansas. They tried to do the popular sovereignty. They tried to vote on whether or not to have slavery there, and each time there was so much fraud in it, nobody was secure that the right decision had been made with the election. We ended up with sort of two governments vying for control in Kansas. And then there was John Brown. And John Brown was an abolitionist who, with his supporters and some of his sons, engaged in something that I call the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, and I've been told that I'm mispronouncing it, but saying Pottawatomie just makes me happy. So the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, John Brown and his supporters go into slaveholding families and attack them and chop them up in their beds. By the end of 1856, roughly 200 settlers had been killed in Kansas from all of this Bleeding Kansas, Bloody Kansas activity. We also, and that's going to make Northerners and Southerners really feel like the other side has become irrational. We also see some violence in the Senate. In 1856, a senator named Charles Sumner from Massachusetts is going to verbally attack a Southern senator named Andrew Butler from South Carolina. He personally maligns him. And a couple of days later, the Southern senator, Butler's nephew will come onto the floor of the Senate and attack Senator Sumner, beating him about the head and shoulders with a cane, and do significant damage to Sumner with that cane. So you see the tensions really increasing. We come to the election of 1856, and there was an American party who ran Millard Fillmore. The Republicans, just this little early development party, supported John C. Fremont, and then you had the Democrats who supported James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, and Buchanan will win. We also see, leading toward the Civil War, something called the Dred Scott case. And it's the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave to an army doctor, and he had been taken into free territories as he traveled with the army doctor. When the doctor died, Dred Scott was left to a family member, and he sued for his freedom, saying that because he had been taken into free territory, he ought to be free. Well, the Supreme Court said, first, we need to decide if he even has a right to bring a case to us, since he's just a slave, not a citizen. And what they decide there is he didn't have the right to bring the case because he was not a citizen. But they decide to hear the case anyway and to rule on it anyway. And what they ruled was that slaves are property, and property can be taken anywhere you take your property. So I guess much like your suitcase is your suitcase no matter where you travel with that suitcase, your slave is your slave no matter where you travel with that slave. The significance of that is it means you could have slavery anywhere in the United States. You simply go to the South to buy them, but then you can take them anywhere in the United States. So we don't need a Missouri Compromise of 1820 anymore. We don't need to worry about slave territories and free territories and slave states and free states or any of that, because the Supreme Court has ruled you can have slavery everywhere. Now, John Brown did not get caught after the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. He moves over to the east, and he and his supporters will participate in a raid on Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry was in Virginia. It is now in West Virginia, but there wasn't a West Virginia yet. Harper's Ferry had a federal arsenal where the military kept weapons. So John Brown and his supporters hit that arsenal with the plan to take the weapons and to spread them around so that the slaves could have a big insurrection. He will be stopped and trapped, though, by members of the Virginia militia, led by Robert E. Lee. And several of John Brown's supporters were killed, but John Brown was not. He is going to be seized, tried, convicted, and hanged. And when they hanged him, he then became a martyr for the cause. It takes us to the election of 1860. The Democrats were divided into Northern and Southern Democrats, with the Northern Democrats running Stephen Douglas, the Southern Democrats running John Breckinridge. We also see the Republicans running, of course, Abraham Lincoln, and then there was a group called the Constitutional Unionists who ran John Bell. Generally speaking, the way the ballots worked out, if you were voting in the North, you had a choice between Douglas and Lincoln. If you were voting in the South, you had a choice between Breckinridge and Bell. When the votes were cast, Lincoln had won 39% of the popular vote, but he had gotten 180 electoral votes, which was a majority of the electoral votes. Coming in second was Breckinridge there on the Southern ballots. Well, this seems to be the final straw for some of these Southern states, particularly South Carolina, and South Carolina seceded on December 20th of 1860. Mind you, these votes would have been counted in Congress and certified in early December of 1860. And so South Carolina makes this decision rather quickly. It had been on their mind for a while, though. They will be followed by a series of other Southern states up until February 1st, and then on February 7th, 1861, the Confederate States of America was created. On February 9th, Jefferson Davis was picked to be the President of the Confederate States of America, the CSA, with Alexander Stephens as his Vice President.